There was once, in a faraway land, a special little elf. He was the shape and look of a little boy, with a cap on his head, but he had wings on his back. And he was so small, you could barely see him. He was about the size of a mug, or you might say a midge, or perhaps a mosquito. Yeah, and just like a mosquito, once you saw him and said, "Ah, there he is," he would seem to disappear. Now, this little elf lived in a rose garden by a very great house. He lived in a rose itself. The soft petals of the rose were his home. All of the other elves and the creatures of the garden called him the Rose Elf. And he liked this name much better than the name his mother gave him. I shall not tell you what that was. Well, one evening, the Rose Elf was nestling down into his rose for his night's rest. Oh, but he could not sleep. There was a terrible noise outside of his rose in the garden. And when he peeked out of his rose, he saw two huge human creatures, a man and a woman, sitting on a bench right below his rose. You can just imagine how gigantic these humans looked to the little elf, and how thunderous their voices sounded in his tiny ears. Though if you or I could have heard those humans speaking, we would have thought they were speaking quite gently and softly. The young man said, "I must leave you. I must go away on business, for my master, your brother, has sent me away. I know that he does not like me very much, and he hates for us to be together. But he has sent me away far over the mountains on business. However, I will be successful on my journey, and I will return rich enough that your brother will not disapprove of us being married. For my bride you shall be." Well, they kissed, and the young woman, she started to cry, and she reached up and she plucked a rose off the rose bush. It was the very rose the Rose Elf was in. Oh my! And then this young woman, she gave the rose a big kiss. Oh, well, normally the Rose Elf would like a little kiss, but this kiss was so huge and terrible that it almost broke all of his bones. Oh! Well, she gave the rose to the young man and said, "Take this rose with my kiss as a token of my love for you, and as a token of my desire that you will return to me soon and safe." The young man took the rose and placed it in the buttonhole of his coat. Once again, they hugged and kissed. The poor elf was nearly crushed with the huge hug. "Must these humans love so roughly?" he asked himself. "Night is coming," said the young man, "but I will hurry off so that I might return to you even sooner than we might be married." Once again, they kissed goodbye. "These humans do an awful lot of kissing," thought the Rose Elf, and off the young man went. He knew the dark forest road well. He was not afraid. Even though he knew it well, he did not know that there was someone else in the forest that night. Someone with evil in his heart. It was his master, the brother of his loved one. This man hated the young man for seeing his sister, and when he saw him leave, he hatched an evil plan. He followed the young man into the dark forest. Well, the young man, he sat down by a linden tree at the fork of the forest road. He pulled the rose from his buttonhole and started to smell it. And as he did, that wicked brother stabbed him to death. "I'll cut off his head to make sure that he is dead," he cried, and that he did. Well, the wicked man buried the head and the body in the loose dirt and leaves underneath the linden tree. He laughed to himself and said, "He went away at night through the mountains. He probably fell off a cliff. I've never seen him again. That's the story I will tell. My sister will soon forget this young fool." Oh, what a terrible man he was. Well, as he had been digging the grave, his hat had fallen off, and as he was moving the leaves around, one leaf from the linden tree had fallen into the wicked man's hair. Well, when his dirty deed was done, he put his cap back on and headed home through that dark forest road. But he was not alone. You see, when all this terrible deed began, the rose elf flew out of the rose, and he flew onto a linden leaf, the very one that landed in the wicked man's hair. And when the man put on his cap once again, the rose elf was trapped inside his hat, traveling back to the man's house, shaking with fear and anger. "What a terrible thing he has done!" cried the rose elf, but no one heard him. Well, before sunrise, the evil man returned to his own house. He sneaked into the bedroom of his sister, where she lay sleeping, dreaming of her loved one coming back to her soon. He laughed to himself. She will never see him again. And he turned and left. But he had taken off his hat, and as he had turned to leave, the linden leaf in his hair, it fell on to his sister's bed. The rose elf flew from the leaf right up to the sleeping woman's ear and told her of what had happened. "Your brother has murdered your loved one," he said to her very softly in her ear. She thought she was having a dream, a nightmare as it were. "He has buried the body and cut off your lover's head and buried it next to the body by the linden tree at the fork of the forest road. When you awake, you will find a linden leaf on your bed, so that you will know that this is true." Well, the young woman awoke with a start from this terrible dream she was having, and there on her bed was a linden leaf, just a small one, and she knew that the dream was true. Her lover was dead and buried in the forest. Oh, what bitter tears she cried. She knew that she could not tell anyone. Who would believe such a story, such a dream that she had? As the day came, her wicked brother came into her room and found her crying. "Oh, Crying over your lover boy? Well, he's out in the big world for the first time on his own. He's probably looking for a new girl to love. I would forget about him if I were you. Oh, he was a terrible man. Well, that night, the young woman sneaked out of her house after dark. She ran to the fork in the forest road, and there she found the linden tree, and she dug in the soft dirt and leaves underneath the linden tree. And there, to her horror, she found the body and the head of her beloved. Oh, she cried so bitterly. She could not take her beloved's body back for a proper burial. But she lifted his head and brushed off the leaves and the dirt. She kissed the cold, pale lips. And she said, "This shall be mine forever." She gently placed the head in a basket that she had brought with her. There was a star jasmine plant growing next to the linden tree, and she broke off a branch and put it in the basket, and quickly she carried this home through the dark forest. Before the sun rose, she took one of the biggest pots, flower pots, from her garden, and she put it in her room, filled it with dirt, and gently placed her loved one's head inside, covered it over, and then planted the star jasmine bush, or branch, on top. She watered it with her tears, which didn't seem to end. The next day, the brother came in, saw the jasmine bush, and saw her crying. "Why are you crying over a flower? Is this for your loved one?" "I would forget him if I were you." Oh, she could not tell anyone what she knew to be true. Well, she cried over that jasmine branch every day. The branch flourished under her tears. The little rose elf, he stayed in a potted petunia in the girl's room, just to be by her and give her comfort if he could. Well, as the days passed, the jasmine bush flourished. Day by day it grew greener and greener. But the young lady grew paler and paler. She pined for her loved one. Well, after many days, the young woman put her head down upon the ledge near the potted jasmine plant, and she drifted off to sleep. She dreamed of her lover. The rose elf flew to her ear. He talked about happier times when she and her lover were sitting on the bench underneath the rose bush. The young woman smiled. She dreamed, and slowly her life ebbed away. She died, but her spirit went immediately to heaven, where she was greeted by the young man she loved so much. Well, the brother, when he discovered his sister was dead, he had her buried immediately that day. And he took a fancy to this flowering jasmine plant that she had in her room, and he moved it into his room so that each night he could smell the sweet scent of the jasmine flowers. But the rose elf had hidden in that pot, and when the brother was gone, he went to each flower and told them the evil thing that had happened, what the man had done. Now the jasmine flowers each had a spirit, and the jasmine flowers said, "We know all about it. We know what evil this man has done. For haven't we grown from the head of the poor young man that was murdered? Hasn't he nourished our roots? We know what is done. We know what must be done." "How can you be so calm?" cried the Rose Elf. "He's a murderer. He must be punished." Well, the Rose Elf flew out into the garden. He told the bees what the evil man had done. And the bees, they took him straightway to the queen bee. When she heard his story, she declared, "This man is guilty of murder and should be punished. On the morrow, we will fly to that man and sting him to death." "I will lead the charge," cried the Rose Elf. Well, that night, as the Rose Elf, the bees, and everyone else slept, the spirits of the jasmine plant surrounded the evil brother, each one armed with a poisoned spear. In his ear they whispered terrible stories that made him scream in fright, "Ah!" And when he opened his mouth, they all stabbed his tongue with their poisoned spears. "Ah! Ah!" His tongue swelled up, and he died, gasping for breath. The jasmine flowers said, "Now the young lovers have been avenged," and they returned to their plant. The next morning, the Rose Elf was riding on the queen bee's back, and they were flying through the window. "Charge!" yelled the Rose Elf. They were ready to sting the man to death, but when they arrived, he was already dead, surrounded by a few of his friends. And the people were looking around. One of the men there said, "I wonder if something in the jasmine plant could have killed him." Then the Rose Elf knew exactly what had happened. He explained to the queen bee and all the bees what the jasmine flowers had done. And so the queen and all of her bees, they swarmed around the jasmine plant to thank the flowers for serving justice. Well, the humans there, they tried to shoo the bees away. One man, he even picked up the pot to move it outside. When he did so, one of the bees stung his hand. Crash! Blum, blum, blum. The pot broke into pieces and out rolled the skull. "Could this not be the skull of our young friend who disappeared?" said the people. "This man must have been a murderer." The elf knew at that time that justice had been served. Well, the bees hummed a little song about the brave Rose Elf and the lovers avenged. I heard that song when I was in a garden in a faraway land. And that is the story I have told to you. And these are the parts of the story that I like the best.